All right, jumping right in. Let's take a deep dive today into, this potential ceasefire between Hezbollah and Israel.
Mm.
We've got these news excerpts, that are shedding light on how this is all unfolding.
Yeah.
And I think, we should really unpack it all. Like, who are the major players?
Right.
What's actually in this proposal? And what are the stakes for both sides?
Yeah.
And even the region as a whole.
Yeah, I think the timing of all this is really fascinating.
Oh,
You
absolutely.
know, I mean, we're seeing this push for diplomacy,
Right.
but it's in the middle of like a really, really tense situation in the Middle East.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, this isn't just like, another blip on the radar.
Another conflict.
Yeah, the scale of this potential ceasefire and what it
Mhm.
could mean. I mean, it's
Yeah.
a pretty big deal.
Oh, wait.
But before we get too far into it,
Yeah,
can you kind of give us the background on who all is involved
of course.
for, people who might not be totally up to speed?
Yeah, so we've got Hezbollah,
Mm-hmm.
which is, a really powerful group in Lebanon.
Right,
And then you have Israel.
right.
And they have this long and complicated history of conflict with each other.
Oh, for sure.
And recently, things have escalated
Right.
pretty badly. And unfortunately, that's resulted in, civilian casualties
Oh,
on
yeah.
both sides, which just,
Right.
really shows how urgently we need to find some kind of resolution.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a stark reminder that, we're talking about real lives here
Totally.
that are hanging in the balance.
For sure.
So let's get to the heart of this,
Yeah.
the proposal itself.
Okay.
What are the key points that they're putting forward?
Okay, so the U.S. and Israel,
Mm-hmm.
they've put together this proposal,
Right.
and it includes this 60-day cessation of hostilities,
Okay.
which is, like a pause
Right.
to lay the groundwork for
Artifice.
something more permanent.
Right.
It also includes provisions for Hezbollah to withdraw from southern Lebanon, and then for the Lebanese Armed Forces to step in
Right.
and make sure the region stays secure.
So it sounds like a pretty carefully structured plan
Yeah.
to de-escalate things.
Exactly.
But Hezbollah withdrawing from an area where they've been, a dominant force for years?
Hmm.
I mean, that seems like a really big ask.
Yeah,
What are your thoughts on that?
it's definitely not going to be easy.
Right.
It's a really complex situation.
Right.
For example, are the Lebanese Armed Forces actually ready
Right.
to take on that security role?
Right.
They're going to need a lot of resources.
Mhm.
They'll need training.
Yeah.
And they'll probably even need international support if
Right.
they want to effectively fill that void.
Right.
It's a huge undertaking.
Yeah.
And there are some pretty valid concerns
Right.
about whether it's actually possible.
Yeah. I can see that. And on top of all of that, we've got, what we might call the Trump factor.
Yes, definitely.
Right.
That adds a whole other layer to everything. It's interesting because
Yeah.
President-elect Trump,
Yeah.
even though he hasn't been inaugurated yet,
Right.
he's already said he supports these talks.
Mm.
But at the same time, he doesn't want to look like he's pressuring Israel.
Yeah. That's a very delicate, tightrope.
Totally.
Trying to show that he supports peace efforts,
Mm-hmm.
but also maintain that strong relationship with a key ally.
Yeah.
Do we have any insight into,
I mean,
what's motivating Trump to be so involved?
it's hard to say for
Yeah.
sure, but we
Okay.
can speculate.
Sure.
This could be his way of trying to, establish himself as like a proactive leader
Okay.
on the world stage,
Right.
even before he officially takes over.
Gotcha.
Plus, the potential for a big foreign policy win early on in his term.
Yeah.
I mean, that might be pretty appealing.
Yeah, for sure. It's interesting to think about how his involvement now
Right.
would really set the tone
That's
for how his administration deals with the Middle East.
It's absolutely
That's
his term.
Yeah. And beyond just Trump himself,
Mm-hmm.
it raises the question of how his whole administration
Right.
will see this ceasefire proposal.
Right.
What will it mean for U.S. foreign policy in the region?
Right.
These are all important things to think about
Yeah.
as this whole thing plays out.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we've got this potential ceasefire,
Right.
a new U.S. president about to, enter the scene,
Yeah.
and a whole lot of uncertainty.
Definitely a lot of moving pieces.
But what about the good stuff?
Right.
What are the benefits here?
Mhm.
Like, what's pushing both sides
Yeah.
to actually try and make this thing happen?
So for Israel, a major motivation is trying to help the civilians up north.
Okay.
We're talking about 60,000 people
Wow.
who have been displaced.
Okay.
The conflict has completely disrupted their lives.
Right.
And a ceasefire would at least, give them a chance to get back to some kind of normal. Yeah, absolutely. It's so easy to get lost in all the political stuff.
Mm-hmm.
but it's the people living there who are really feeling the impact of all of this.
Totally.
So what about Hezbollah?
Yeah.
What do they stand to gain here?
Well, the recent Israeli offensive has really taken a toll on their capabilities.
Okay.
A ceasefire would give them time to, you know, kind of regroup,
Right.
rebuild,
Okay.
and consolidate their position.
So a chance to, catch their breath
Exactly.
and reassess.
Yeah.
But I imagine there's got to be more to it than that, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Okay.
There's also a potential political upside for them.
Okay.
By coming to the table,
Right.
engaging in these talks, they can really try to improve their image,
Okay.
both domestically and internationally.
Makes sense.
It lets them say, hey, look, we're willing to work towards peace.
Yeah. It's strategic, showing that they're not just about conflict.
Mm-hmm.
They can be responsible actors on the
Yes.
world stage.
No.
But let's be real.
Yeah.
The Middle East is a very complicated place.
Oh, it's incredibly complicated.
There's got to be some serious obstacles
Oh, yeah.
to overcome if this ceasefire is actually going to work.
Big time.
We talked about, Hezbollah withdrawing,
Right.
the Lebanese army stepping in.
Mm-hmm.
What other hurdles do you see?
Well, internal politics are a huge factor.
Okay.
You've got hardliners on both sides
Yeah.
who may not want to give up anything.
Right.
They might see it as a sign of weakness.
Okay.
So getting them on board with this deal
It's going to be crucial.
absolutely crucial.
So it's not just about, Israel and Hezbollah agreeing.
Right.
It's about dealing with all the internal pressure
Yeah.
within each side.
Totally.
There's also the issue of those smuggling routes.
Yeah. That's been a big point of contention.
Yeah.
They've got to find a solution that works for everybody.
Right. This all sounds incredibly complicated.
Is it?
If a deal actually is reached, what kind of timeline are we looking at here?
Well, the U.S. and Israel want to finalize this as quickly as possible,
Okay.
but there's no set date.
Okay.
The sense of urgency is definitely there, though.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, every day that goes by without a ceasefire
Yeah.
just means more lives are being affected,
Right.
and the risk of things escalating even further just keeps growing.
Yeah. The stakes are incredibly high. You mentioned earlier that UN Resolution 1701 is relevant here.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Can you kind of unpack that for us?
Okay, so UN Resolution 1701,
Mm-hmm.
this was passed back in 2006.
Right.
It basically lays out a roadmap for peace in the region.
Okay.
It calls for, armed groups to withdraw from southern Lebanon.
Right.
And for UN peacekeepers to be deployed.
Okay.
And it's still incredibly relevant today.
Wow. So this resolution from over a decade ago
Yeah.
is still the framework.
It's the framework they're working with.
That's fascinating. So if this ceasefire does succeed,
Mm-hmm.
would that be like a step towards fully realizing what that resolution laid out?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It could really build momentum
Okay.
and create an environment where the terms of the resolution can actually be implemented.
Right. But we've got to address the,
Yeah.
elephant in the room here.
Right.
What if it fails?
Yeah. What happens then?
What are the potential consequences
Right.
if this doesn't hold?
A resurgence of violence is a real possibility.
Okay.
And it could be even worse than what we've already seen.
Oh, wow.
It would be a huge setback for any peace efforts
Right.
and could really destabilize the whole region.
Yeah. Not to mention what it would do to the people involved in the negotiations.
Oh, totally.
Hmm.
A failed ceasefire would completely damage their credibility.
Yeah.
It could lead to even deeper distrust between the two sides.
Right.
And that would just make future negotiations that much harder.
Yeah, for sure. We've been talking a lot about the, political and strategic side of things.
Yeah.
But our sources also talk about, how devastating this conflict has been for people.
Oh, absolutely.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
The reports coming out of Lebanon are just heartbreaking. Hundreds of civilian casualties.
Right.
Over 1 million people displaced from their homes.
Wow.
Entire communities just shattered by the fighting.
Yeah, it's easy to forget that, behind the headlines
Right.
and all the political back and forth,
Yeah.
there are real people
Yeah.
whose lives have been completely turned upside down.
Absolutely. Their lives are in pieces.
Right. And the impact goes way beyond just the immediate casualties.
Yeah. With so many people displaced,
Right.
it's a full-blown humanitarian crisis.
Wow.
There's not enough food.
Mm-hmm.
There's not enough water.
Right.
Medical supplies are running low.
Jeez.
Basic services have been disrupted.
Right.
And for a country that was already facing so many challenges,
Yeah.
the long-term consequences of this are hard to even imagine.
Yeah, it's like a ripple effect.
Yeah. It touches every part of life in Lebanon.
And that's why this ceasefire,
Right.
if it actually happens, could be so important.
Huge.
It's not just about stopping the violence.
Right.
It's about creating a space for humanitarian aid to get through,
Yes.
to reach the people who need it most,
Absolutely.
and giving them a chance to start rebuilding.
Exactly. It's a potential turning point,
Yeah.
a glimmer of hope
Right.
in the middle of all this devastation.
Okay. But even if the ceasefire holds the road to peace,
Yeah.
I mean, that's a long and difficult one.
It's a long road.
Right?
There are deep-seated grievances on both sides.
Right.
Historical wounds,
Mhm.
complex interests that all need to be addressed.
Right.
This is just the first step
Okay.
in a very long and complicated journey.
A journey that requires a lot of patience
Absolutely.
and understanding and willingness to compromise on everybody's part.
For sure. And a recognition that there are no easy answers here.
Right.
The situation in the Middle East is incredibly nuanced.
It is. So what's the main thing you want our listener to take away from this deep dive?
I think it's so important to remember that conflicts like this are rarely black and white. There are so many layers to unpack.
Right.
You've got the historical context, the political maneuvering,
Right.
and the deeply personal stakes for everyone involved.
It's easy to simplify things when you're just reading the headlines.
Totally.
But the reality on the ground is much more complicated than that.
It really is. Taking the time to understand all those nuances,
Right.
hearing different perspectives, and really having these thoughtful discussions, that's how we move towards a more informed
Right.
and hopefully more peaceful world.
I love that. It really puts things in perspective. It feels like we've covered a lot.
Yeah.
But what does it all mean for, the average person?
Right.
What's the big takeaway here?
I think the biggest thing is just to remember that these conflicts, they're rarely so simple.
Right.
It's not just good guys and bad guys.
Right.
There's so much more to it. Historical context,
Yeah.
political maneuvering,
Right.
and everyone involved has something really personal at stake.
It's so easy to just, read a headline and think you understand what's going on.
Totally.
But the reality is so much more nuanced than that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
It's about really taking the time to understand those nuances,
Right.
hearing different perspectives,
Yeah.
and having, real conversations. That's how we become more informed.
Okay.
And hopefully that leads to a more peaceful world.
I love that. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what's the one thing you want our listener to really think about today?
Imagine you're sitting at that negotiating table.
Okay.
You're representing either Israel or Lebanon.
Wow.
What's your top priority?
Right.
What would you be willing to give up?
Mm-hmm.
And what would you absolutely refuse to budge on?
Yeah. That's a tough question.
It is.
How do you balance what your country needs
Right.
with the desire for a peace that actually lasts and that benefits everyone in the region?
It's a huge challenge.
Yeah, there are no easy answers.
Definitely not.
Yeah.
But just thinking about those questions, it helps us understand what those people are up against
Right.
as they try to build peace in such a volatile part of the world.
Absolutely. Well, to our listener, we hope this deep dive has given you a better understanding of, all the complexities surrounding this potential ceasefire and the human stories that are really at the heart of it all.
And as you go about your day, we encourage you to think about the people whose lives are being directly affected by this and how important it is to find solutions that put peace and human dignity first.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It was my pleasure.
We'll see you next time.